Okay. Okay. First, as pivotal to the understanding of the experience of Asian Americans is being deprived of the opportunity for citizenship. Because once you have citizenship, you're entitled to certain rights, like the right to vote, which is pivotal to obtaining power. And so the Act of 1790, as you see here, August 1790, restricted citizenship to free white persons. So Africans, Latinos, Asians, Native Americans were not allowed to become a citizen. And back in those days, if you weren't a citizen, you couldn't own property, you couldn't vote, you couldn't do many things that puts people on equal access to equal power. So that was far reaching, the Act of 1790. And I can't go through the number of discriminatory laws that were in place after Asians first started coming to the United States. The major influx in 1850s to help mine gold on the West Coast, farming, etc. And then later to build the railroads. But as Asians came, resistance continued to grow against what they perceived as a threat to the status quo. And so this is an interesting picture leading up to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It's dark, I know, because this photo obviously is old, but at the top, this paper came out in 1879. And as you see on the left, this is after the Civil War, that efforts to help African Americans integrate was being met with great resistance. And so you see at the corner here on this picture, mob law, that the mob was, waiting to overthrow Mr. Dixon, who was trying to, find ways to help integrate Africans after the Civil War, and people were resisting that. And so, and then on the right, at the same time that on the East Coast and elsewhere, integration was being resisted, was an effort on the West Coast to exclude Asian from the United States. And again, interestingly enough, you see mob law there. And so the California plan, the Mississippi plan, was basically to rid the area of certain marginalized groups that the status quo did not want. And then to add insult to injury was the infamous case People versus Hall in 1854. And that involved the death, the killing of a Chinese person. And this alleged assailant was a white male, and he was convicted based upon the testimony of Chinese witnesses. And it was appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically said in this decision that if you look at the fifth or sixth paragraph down, if the term white as used in the Constitution was not understood in its generic sense as including Caucasian race and necessarily excluding all others, where was the necessary of providing for the admission of Indians to the privilege of voting by special legislation? We are of the opinion that the words white, Negro, mulatto, Indian, and Black person, wherever they occur in our Constitution and laws, must be taken in their generic sense, and that even admitting the Indian of this continent is not of the Mongolian type, that the words Black person in the 14th section must be taken as contradistinguished, meaning as distinguishable from white, and necessarily excludes all races other than the Caucasian. So basically saying that at the last paragraph, the anomalous spectacle of a distinct people living in our community, recognizing no laws of the state, except though necessity, bringing with them their prejudices and national feuds in which they indulge upon open violation of the law, a race of people whom nature has marked as inferior and who are incapable of progress or intellectual development beyond a certain point, as their history has shown, et cetera, that they must be kept from the further privilege of participating with us in administering the affairs of our government, which includes testifying in courts. So basically, this decision said that Chinese, like African Americans, like Indians, like the mulatto, cannot back then testify against whites in court. So overturning basically the conviction of the assailant who killed a Chinese person. And so if you are deprived of that right to testify in a criminal court, then you have very little protection against violence against your community. If you can't even bring them to justice because you can't even testify as to what you saw. So devastating Supreme Court decision. And then if you look, it's back, it's old, that's why it's in writing. This is the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and it excluded laborers from coming to the United States. And so if you look at the first paragraph, 3 sentences from the bottom of the first paragraph, that it shall not be lawful for any Chinese laborer to come or having as come the expiration of said 90 days to remain within the United States. So it basically excluded the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, Chinese laborers from coming to the United States. This act of 1882 was extended for another 10 years and then continued to be extended and wasn't repealed until the mid-1940s, when China helped the United States in World War II. Then they lifted it. But no sooner had the Chinese Exclusion Act been passed, then came the Act of 1917. And it set up what was called the Asiatic Barred Zone. And what that meant is below a certain line, all these countries that are in orange would be excluded from coming to the United States. Purple, which was China, was dealt with by the Chinese Exclusion Act. And then you see subsequent to that, all these other Asian countries that were excluded from coming to the United States by the Act of 1917. And again, this act was not lifted until the mid-1940s. And then you notice on this map that Japan is noticeably not in this frame of countries that are excluded, because at that time, Japan had a very sophisticated naval fleet, and United States did not want to antagonize it. But that was in 1917, but it took just a few more years for Japan to be included in the Act of 1924. And the Act of 1924 basically excluded all African, all Asian countries from coming to the United States. And what they set up was a quota system. And they gave 150,000 quotas each year to in proportion to their population in the United States. So you can see Great Britain and Northern England got 65,721 of these visas. Next comes Germany, and then comes Ireland, etc. And you see overwhelmingly of these 150,000 visas, it went to European white countries. And even though African and Asian countries were excluded from coming into the US, now including Japan, this 100 visas that you see given to African and Asian countries, that was for whites living in those countries. And so this system of in place in 1924 was not lifted until the 1965 Immigration Act. And so what happens when you have a law like this in place for so many years? Well, the European countries grow exponentially because each year they get more share of the visas. And if the proportion of that 150,000 visas is based on the number of people living here, then each year they get more and more visas. And so the country becomes more and more white, and minorities become fewer and fewer. And this is important because this resonates today as to how to control marginalized communities is largely through immigration laws. Okay, and fast forward, the acts of these laws don't operate in itself. It's not the legislature alone who passes these laws. It's the executive branch, the president at the time, who signs these laws into effect, and the judiciary who upholds these laws. And so one of the most historical discriminatory laws, other than the Chinese Exclusion Act, is the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Over 120,000 persons of Japanese descent were put in concentration camps in this country for upwards of 4.5 so years. And they were put in desert, in horse stalls in the desert to live in. And as we saw many years later, not a single person of Japanese descent was charged and convicted of espionage or sabotage to the United States. And the reason that they did this was motivated by political issues, and the Japanese Americans who were residing in the United States were not a threat to the United States. But this theme of exclusion, of being different, etc., and always being viewed as the outsider, the foreigner, carries over to today, and we're going to get to that in a second. And so again, moving on, the next major discriminatory law was special registration after 9/11, 2001. And the attack on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, in 2001. And our government required that nationals from 24 out of 25 countries report to immigration. And they had to be people who were not citizens of the United States or green card holders of the United States. So if they were naturalized citizens, they didn't have to report. But many students, many international students who were in status, who were from these 24 out of the 25 of these 25 countries were Arab, Muslim, and South Asian. The 25th country was North Korea. But we don't have many people from North Korea here. And so, these nationals from these countries who were in the US, whether they were students, business, etc., were required to report to immigration. and they had to be ID'd, photographed, etc. And the reason why, this is government's own records. Look, first paragraph, why is U.S. government doing this? And look at that. In light of the attacks against the United States on September 11th, 2001, and subsequent events, and based on information available to the Attorney General has determined that certain non-immigrant aliens require closer monitoring when national security or law enforcement interests are raised. Get that, black and white. The Attorney General has determined that certain non-immigrant aliens require closer monitoring when national security or law enforcement interests are raised. And so after these group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4, predominantly Arab, Muslim, and South Asian groups reported, then miraculously the government stopped the program, and they said they could come up with a more efficient way of doing things rather than special registration. And so you determine whether or not it was their intention all along to stop this program after 25 mostly Arab, Muslim, and countries went first. And so because that was one of their defense, they said, hey, we're just starting with Arab, Muslim, and South Asian countries, but we're going to have all nationals from all countries report to immigration. But after the Arab and Muslim countries were required to go first, they stopped the program. Okay, and so then you fast forward even further, and you have the Muslim bans 1, 2, 3, and 4 that were instituted under President Trump, signed by executive order by the President of the United States, and that excluded people from largely, again, Arab and Muslim countries. President Biden, when he came into office, lifted the Muslim bans. And why is this all important? Because when particularly the government engages in racial profiling, ethnic profiling, it sends a green light to private persons that certain groups are less deserving, they're inferior, and gives justification for treating them differently, and in the most extreme form, through violence. And so Vincent Chin was beaten the night before his wedding by 2 white auto workers who blamed him in the 1990s for the decline of the American automobile industry in Detroit, Michigan. He was Chinese American, not Japanese American. They mistook him for being Japanese, and they bludgeoned him to death with a baseball bat swung repeatedly on his head. And then we fast forward to obviously COVID-19 and the misplaced fear of COVID-19 on Asians living in the United States. And so this is some of the incidences. This suspect went into a Sam's Club broad daylight and stabbed a young 5-year-old boy, the father, and the infant child, and luckily they survived. And you have various statements by the then President of the United States referring it to the Chinese virus. And when a president tweets, he has a huge platform that people can then begin to associate words of the President of the United States as justifying certain actions. And here, when he was giving a speech there, instead of calling it the coronavirus. He replaced it with the words the Chinese virus, you see on the right-hand corner of his notes. And then when he was accused of inciting racial fear, and great pressure was put on him by several groups to refrain from calling it a Chinese virus. He said, look, everyone knows it came out of China, but I decided we shouldn't make any more of a big deal out of it. I think I made a big deal. I think people understand it. And this was an incident that an organization that I founded helped to intervene and step up. This was in New York City. Teens were charged with a hate crime for attacking a woman on a bus in the Bronx and saying she caused coronavirus. And we had 3 of the 4 individuals involved in this attack be part of our hate crimes prevention art project for teenagers. And I can honestly say on my mother's grave that they would never commit another crime again. They learned confidence in our program and not to be a follower, and that they could stand up on their own and beliefs and values. And then, then again, this is the FBI warning of a potential surge in hate crimes, and that the rhetoric fueled even by the highest office in our country has fueled this unprecedented attack on Asian Americans across the country. And this underscores a little bit, this is Dr. Chen Fu, what the dilemma is, on one hand being lauded as a model minority myth, and then on the other hand being attacked for misplaced fears. So here is a doctor at NYU Langone Medical Center, and he says, it's hard to both be celebrated for being a frontline hero and at the same time being villainized and attacked for the virus at the same time. And so his story is well laid out. And then we move even further forward, the resistance to critical race theory in K-12 education. That if we can't teach people about all these discriminatory laws that impacted African, Latinos, and Asian Americans and American Indians, then how can we redress these wrongs if people don't know about them? And so there has been a recent aggressive attack on critical race theory, and that's what CRT stands for. And not only do Idaho and North Dakota legislation specifically mention the words critical race theory, 36 states in less blatant language have restricted education on critical race theory, racism, bias, the contributions of specific racial or ethnic groups to the US history or related topics. So at a time when at the same time there is progress of critical race theory in states like Connecticut, New Jersey, Oregon, etc., it's at the same time being attacked. And then this is our hate crimes prevention art project. It's now in its 16th year, and we've originally founded it as a empowerment training for teenagers to speak out against hate crimes. But in the last 2 years, because of the surge and increase in violence against Asian Americans, we have also made it a diversion program for youth charged with a hate crime. If they complete our program, they will not be put through the criminal justice system. So that is basically, in a nutshell, a very, very brief history of discrimination against Asian Americans historically and present day that we are facing. And I'd like to open it up now for discussion and get what you're observing as we now celebrate Asian American Heritage Month. So I'm going to stop share and hopefully I can see all of your faces. Okay. Okay. All right. So let's see.
Oh, hi, Professor OuYang. It's so good to see you.
Great to see you back.
Yes. Also, Amani. I don't know if you remember, as was also
Yes,
one of your former
Bonnie.
students.
Yes. Hi.
I think she's like in an Uber right now, but she really wanted to join in.
Great. That's great. Yes.
But yeah, I feel like, I mean, we like talk all the time about how like that huge like book of court cases that you had us read, that were so instrumental, I think, to us understanding how law has defined race in this country. And I feel like, I'm not quite sure if you mentioned this in your presentation, maybe you did, but I feel like one of the many ones that sort of stuck out to me was that I think it was the case of a South Asian Sikh man who, yeah, the way that he argued to get citizenship, I feel like it was like the early 1900s, was that he argued that technically Caucasian refers to the Caucasus, which are in South Asia or something like that. So I think it's just, that's like a fascinating, I think, example of all the different ways I think various people who are not white have tried to at least get a portion of like the privilege of whiteness, I guess.
And that's the thing, and that's the current debate that you guys are a part of right now. That those that are resisting critical race theory, think that topics of white superiority or an institution that's based and formed and perpetuated based on notions of white superiority should not be taught in K through 12 or even beyond that. They see that there's a difference between unconscious biases versus an intentional way in which the country was built to benefit and to support the status quo of a certain group of people. And, it's hard, Rebecca and Imani and others, that to not teach about the dangers of white superiority when it's embedded in legislation. You saw in the People versus Hall and other forms of legislation how they treat marginalized community as less than. You saw from the cases that you're talking about, Boggs and Thin, where what mattered was the color of your skin, and if all other things, qualifications are not contested, et cetera, what was being contested was the color of their skin. And so, so when it's embedded in cases, when it's embedded in laws, how do you right the wrong unless you do talk about how white superiority is deeply entrenched in our systems, but that is a threat to many in status quo, and there now is a very live controversy going around this country to prevent critical race theory. And you saw in Florida not to talk about sexual orientation in grammar school, high school, etc. You know what I mean? So this wave is happening at a time when in 2045 we will be a majority minority country. You know what I mean? So how can you rationalize not correcting these historic wrongs if you can't mention the premise upon which they were built upon?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like, if I may, I don't know if anyone else wanted to say something. I feel like another thing that your class made think a lot about is that, like, I think how even before, how I guess like even the term people of color is sort of aspirational, right? That there is that we should feel like we have something in common with each other and be working towards common goals. Because we've seen because of all the cases that we sort of studied. Like I'm thinking about another case, and it's also fascinating how people use like the exact letter of the law in order to sort of advance, the few rights that maybe, their particular group could access. Like I remember there was another case. I'm not good with names. I'm sorry. I memorized them for your exams, and then I remember the information, maybe not the names and the dates, but I remember there was like a case in California, right, where I think it was Mexican Americans arguing that they should be allowed to attend the same public schools as white children because I think the California state constitution, Amani knows, the California state constitution only specifically said that Orientals or something could not attend those schools. And so it's interesting how like that sort of discriminatory language ended up being, I think, a successful access point for people of Mexican descent in California. I don't know. I think that just is one of the cases that makes me think about, I don't
Well,
know.
many remember Ozawa, when he tried to go for naturalized citizenship, he was a person, an American of Japanese descent, and I mean, living in America of Japanese descent, and he tried to argue, I'm not Chinese. That there was explicitly the Chinese Exclusion Act, but there hadn't been an Exclusion Act against Japanese. And so one of the things that he argued was that he wasn't Chinese, you know what I mean? So he should be included. He wasn't Black, so he should be viewed as white and be allowed to attend the school or be allowed to be naturalized under the Act of 1790 that reserved citizenship for free white males. And he was saying, well, that meant if you're not Black, then you're white and you should be allowed. And, I'm not Chinese either, that was specifically excluded. So you see this pitting against each other. And you saw it in Plessy versus Ferguson. In the dissent, they were saying, that how could you let a person who is American of African descent not ride in the car with whites, but technically, based on the statute, someone who was a Mongolian could ride in the car with whites because the statute said, Blacks and whites could not sit in the same car. But in reality, Mongolians also could not ride in the car with whites either, and so there's this constant, pitting and against one another when in reality, yes, as Dr. Kadiba said, is divide and conquer. When in reality, we actually are in the same boat and be treated, likewise as less than and as a second-class citizen. Because remember, in our course, there was this whole series of cases of just trying to get citizenship. And then even after we were able to get citizenship, a whole series of cases where they were treated nevertheless as second-class citizens. You know what I mean? So that getting citizenship wasn't the end all. You know what I mean? It's enforcement to be sure that, all people are treated equally. And so, so there's that constant notion. And when we talk about reparations, how can you move a campaign for reparations when people aren't taught why there needs to be reparations, right? And so, this effort to remove from the history books the role of the government, and behind the role of the government are the people enforcing the government, right? And so, how can you remove that and at the same time try to have people understand why reparations are needed? you know what I mean? And so it's contradictory to each other to say no critical race theory, and then try to push for reparations. And so we're in a very difficult time right now.
Yeah, I feel like it's like kind of like wild to hear this much like consternation over critical race theory. Because I don't know about y'all, but like when I was growing up, it did not feel like they were discussing race that much to begin with in history class. It felt like they mentioned race when they were talking about slavery, when they were talking about how many Chinese people died building the Transcontinental Railroad, and then like the civil rights movement, and then I think maybe also like Cesar Chavez, right? That was kind of in. So it's kind of like because I remember like in high school I had a US history teacher who was very intelligent, but he could not tell me what bathroom that Asian Americans would have used during Jim Crow, right? Because that was just not something that I think he was even thinking about. Make imagining problems.
No, very true, Mr. Lecky, very true. Very, very
Yeah, I think that's the thing, right? Because it really, I don't think it wasn't until I went to college and made the conscious choice to take classes related to race studies where I got to learn stuff like this. And like one more thing, I feel like your example of the Azawa case, where he argued that, I'm not Chinese or I'm Japanese, that's why maybe I should get citizenship. I feel like that's also kind of still relevant today because I think Asian Americans, because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, are kind of unique in that, like, I think like about over 60% of people of Asian descent in the US were born outside the US.
right.
That's how like recent, um, I guess our like so many of our people here, I think, are in the US. I was looking at statistics because I had to write a paper specifically on like Korean Americans, I think, and I think literally like 1% of Korean Americans, like people of Korean descent in the US, are over the age of 65, right? So there's not really even people who grew up here and are old, I guess, who like grew up like I did and are old because of the laws like that. And I think what happens with that, right? And we see this with like African immigrants, we see this with Latino immigrants, we see this with Asian immigrants, right? Where they're like, why are you trying to label us all into one group? Why should I have something? You're telling me that I have something in common with those people, but I do not relate to that because I'm from XYZ specific country and culture. So it's kind of funny. Like I took my mom to see Crazy Rich Asians. I thought it was going to be like this like touching moment. And she was like, why did you take me to see a movie about Chinese people? And she was like, why do they call it Crazy Rich Asians? Like not all Asian people are Chinese. She also fell asleep during the last farewell or whatever it was called with Aquafina. I know she started snoring. I had to like keep waking her up, but but yeah, I don't know. That's just I think one of the things that I sort of think about when we think about like why there isn't really as much of a larger Asian American culture, right? It's because so many of our people, I think, it's like it's like I think it is a blessing to be able to know where you come from, but I think it also has had interesting impacts in terms of why it's harder maybe to politically organize all of us as a group. And yeah, and I feel like Jair, we've talked about
Yeah.
how like you've also had experiences where like maybe like African immigrants don't necessarily feel that much in common with I guess Black Americans or people of African, but people the descendants of enslaved people.
I mean, I think you know, when you are a marginalized group, it's hard because marginalized groups are just like majority groups. We are not homogenous. There are many different aspects and viewpoints within every culture and within every racial identity, ethnic identity. But because we are few in number, we are expected politically to be unified in our position. So they don't, as Dr. Diba said, divide and conquer us. When, you know, it's just natural, but we don't have the luxury of being able to be different and have different opinions and different experiences, because they will divide and conquer us if we do, you know what I mean? Um, and so, uh, that becomes very problematic. But I'd like to know, why, what interested you guys about today's topic. As students, what are you seeing in the real world uh, um, that you're trying to negotiate and navigate in this current climate? What are your thoughts?
I have a point of interest and a question as well.
Okay,
So when you mentioned the Immigration Act of, you said 1965, right?
right.
It was interesting because I think in a lot of my K-12 years, we really learned mainly about like the civil rights movement in the 60s. But then at the end of college, I learned of like all the social movements that were parallel happening, like queer social movements and also social movements for folks that are differently abled. So I guess my question is like, what was the climate like for like Asian Americans and like what movements, like what did that look like?
Yeah, I mean, we owe it to many of the civil rights leaders of the 1960s civil rights movement, because uh, Asian Americans were a part of that movement, but you don't see it because mainstream media portrays it as a black-white issue. But there were definitely Latinos and Asian Americans that were part of the 1960s civil rights movement, but you just don't see it, and they definitely learned from the struggles of the civil rights movement to look inward at their communities to see what things needed to be changed, and particularly redress for Japanese Americans during World War II. It was the Sansei generation, the third generation that grew up, um, you know, uh, uh, and were young people, college age students, so forth, in the 1960s, who had not been interned. You know what I mean? They were the third generation, but their parents and grandparents were. They took on the torch of trying to get justice for what happened 40 years earlier. And so you saw in the late 70s and the 1980s an Asian American movement being launched, in universities and so forth, a push for Asian American studies, and redress for Japanese Americans during World War II. And a point of fact, and then, some institutions, and indeed Ivy League institutions, uh, became more political Asian American communities even later than the late 70s and 80s. It was due to a hunger strike in the mid 1990s at Columbia University that we got the Center for the Law for the got the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia undergrad. It was students who engaged in a hunger strike demanding that their histories, their cultures, et cetera, be taught. And as a result of that hunger strike, the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race was formed. At NYU, luckily, the students didn't have to put their health at risk and didn't have to engage in a hunger strike. What they did is through petitioning, getting several signatures, asking for Asian American Studies program to be started at NYU. And that was successful. And now my department at NYU, it's not Asian American Studies separate, Asian American Studies, Latino Studies, Africana Studies, urban affairs, and LGBT uh, departments are merged into the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis. And so, so that we're all together there. And so, it's taken different forms like that. Yeah, I mean, as Dr. Kadiba said, I'm not surprised either, because any laws, whether it be in institutions of education, in government, that are civil rights laws, were passed because of advocacy from the bottom up, from community-based organizations, from the campaigns, that you know, Mr. Lecky was talking about, those movements, the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act of 19, in the 1960s, you know, the bilingual assistance provisions to the Voting Rights Act that were amended later, to departments like, the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, Asian American Studies across the country, et cetera, were started based from the grassroots up, informing leaders, quote unquote, of institutions of the need to have these types of courses. And very much so, it shows the power of the grassroots, it shows the power of our students, and unequivocally, having these classes being taught at various universities and K through 12 is an important part of a person's identity, and what they choose to become involved in and their growth. And I definitely have seen minority students excel because they have these classes and they feel something is applicable to them that they can apply in their real life and in their career choices.
Yeah, well, I guess in what you asked about, like, trends that we're seeing today, and like with the context that you gave, I think like similar to the 60s where maybe like Black African American rights were the forefront, like all the other minority groups kind of like tagged on to like gain traction. Like I definitely think that that's similar to what we're seeing today, where like I feel like a lot of, yes, like Black African American rights are being like talked about, but also like folks are differently abled, like stop Asian hate, um, health disparities, like a lot of social issues that are kind of sparked by one thing in America, like all these smaller, or in terms of numbers, like smaller groups, but equally important issues are also things that we're discussing as well today that I don't think has really been in the limelight historically.
Absolutely. And I think, Black Lives Matter was a major impetus, especially during COVID, to bring certain issues to the forefront. And, and then by the same token, every time marginalized communities get energized, resistance also gets energized. And so you see a effort to clamp down through critical race theory classes, partisan gerrymandering that's going on right now as we speak, and restrictive voting rights laws after the 2020 election, are forms of resistance to movements that are gaining traction, like Black Lives Matter, like Stop Asian Hate, like redistricting, for fair redistricting, that is trying to gain traction. Power is very difficult to relinquish, to share, and that's why the elephant in the room is the changing demographics of this country. Those that empower now can do many things to try to prevent that from happening, to slow it down, but inevitably we will become a majority minority country. And rather than have it be the elephant in the room, I advocate for openly discussing what that transition will be like. So They will not be afraid of you, me, or any other marginalized group. You know, that this transition, I would like it not to be, as the past has foreboded, a violent one, but a peaceful transition. You know, and that happens by us getting to know one another, by having sessions like this, by not being afraid to right the wrong, to correct history, and you know, understand what some of those institutional barriers are, that are what institutions then were built off, that need to be changed. Um, you know, and we need to keep pushing for that, so that we can understand one another better. And so when we become a majority money country, it will not be fraught with resistance, with violence, and other ways to prevent the inevitable from happening. The Imani asked, I'm curious if living in large numbers in, can you read that question out, because my computer is getting cut off.
Yeah, I read out loud for you. Amani said, I'm curious if living in large numbers in ethnic cities like a Chinatown helps bring resources and politically mobilize these communities, and or if it being targeted is a real threat or concern.
Excellent question, Amani. And it's complicated, because as a result of the spike in hate crimes against Asians, more local governments are allocating money to Asian American groups. Not Asian American groups aren't getting their fair share of resources to begin with. So in that sense, it's good, but it's not addressing the root causes of the problems. And it shouldn't totally, Imani, be left to community-based organizations to resolve. So for instance, you guys are now, you and Rebecca in Virginia, but in New York City, going on the third year of the pandemic, the homelessness and mental health issues are off the charts. They have been neglected, the homeless population, forever. But you know, their needs are so much dire now after 3 years of the pandemic, right? And so, you know, not all of the hate crimes against Asians have been committed by people who are homeless or with mental health issues, but an increasing number are. And it should not be the responsibility of community-based organizations to deal with that. You know what I mean? Our city, local, and federal government need to be involved to address not only the homelessness issue in New York City, but you know, across the country, and the unmet mental health needs of the population. So that's one example where money given to community-based organization doesn't exactly deal with the root problems, you know, or some of the root problems that are impacting the community. The other part is, in order for communities to come together, it has to be intentionally done because of the centuries of racial gerrymandering and de jure discrimination. Both of you know, having lived in New York City, as diverse as New York City is, it is racially divided geographically. And so unless you have leaders who intentionally work on projects or programs that bring people from the Bronx together with people, from Brooklyn and Queens, it's just not going to happen. You know what I mean? It doesn't naturally happen. And so, again, it should not be left to community-based organizations to come up with those integrated programs. It also has to deal with housing. When we live amongst each other, then the issues of the environment, the quality of public schools, etc., matter to all of us. But as long as we have, de facto housing discrimination, we are not naturally going to have always the same issues in common. And so, so it giving money isn't the solution to these underlying problems. It requires a plan. It requires an intentional goal of integration. And so it's not solving the issue. And and then how you make the determination which groups get the money, you know what I mean, is another political quagmire. And so that's another issue too. But okay.
Yeah, I had another question. So when we talk about like sort of, I guess, the spike in hate crimes against Asian Americans, especially like in New York City, I guess I was curious as to, I feel like in general, I think there's sort of a divide between, I guess, immigrant parents and like the perspectives of immigrant parents versus their children, their young children that they send to college, right? And their college educated children get to go study race studies classes and I guess form leftist opinions and views, right? And I guess maybe have, are much more, I guess, likely to like be interested or like feel that solidarity with other people of color is something that is both realistic and necessary, right? I feel like a lot of our parents are so focused on survival that like, and they also don't get to, like, they don't have like the money that they do have to spend on classes, right? Their kids go, right? They don't go. I think also immigrants also just tend to live in insulated communities, right? Just because I think there's safety there, you get to experience culture, you share culture with those people anyways. But I think specifically in the context of hate crimes, I think my mom have very different, I think, perspectives on this, right? And I'm kind of curious as to, like, I think my mom is particularly concerned about hate crimes. I think that she also is getting her news from different sources. And I'm curious as to whether you have any opinion on whether some, I guess maybe like Asian focused newspapers or news sites are maybe sensationalizing anything or just putting a certain slant on it. Because I think my mom in particular has said some anti-Black things, because I think some of those newspapers and articles are emphasizing the attacks that are, I guess, perpetrated or at least suspected to be perpetrated by people who are Black. So I was just sort of curious if
let me try to address some of that, and there were other questions in the chat that I want to get to. Part of why the immigrant population doesn't see the benefits of coalition building is because they have also been left out and excluded from meaningful integration. So they have not seen the benefits of integration because they themselves have been excluded. Whereas your generation, and having been in an integrated setting, having had the opportunity to be in a diverse classroom where you share diverse viewpoints, etc., have seen the benefit of integration. And so that's part of the problem in educating the older generation, is because they don't see the benefits of integration because they have been excluded from it as well. And so that's a problem. Now, with respect, and so it requires Rebecca, your generation to help educate the older generation. You know what I mean? And there definitely have been videos on how to go about, addressing that. I'm part of a project called UA3, dealing with food instability around the city. And it's one of the gems that we need at a time when anti-Black and anti-Asian sentiment is high. It is an racial group that is trying to build food security in all different neighborhoods of the city. And so it's a coming together of African, Latino, and Asian American communities to make that happen. And sometimes, when, as Amani pointed out, the government is not doing what it needs to do. Sometimes it's the community who has to, come up with creative ways to work together. And so now with respect to Yvonne's question about admissions, as early as there's been studies that as early as someone is 5 or 6 years old, they've developed their social interaction patterns. And so, I am, as a college professor, as a advocate and a civil rights attorney, a believer in affirmative action, not just in college, but in high schools and in grammar schools, because many people do not go on to college. And so their opportunity to be in an integrated setting is often the classroom. And so I am for admissions policies that look beyond a high stake test score and looks at many variables in order to get a diverse classroom. Yvonne, I can't tell you the number of instances where in my integrated classrooms, I bring examples to classes that are largely monolithic and white, you know what I mean? Because those experiences are not brought out otherwise. And so, I think Yvonne's trying to, or Amani's trying to get in. Did somebody let her in? Okay. Amani, are you in? Okay. Okay. And so, so that's a huge issue. And so, I, think that test scores should be one of many factors, but not the exclusive factor, because of all the biases in tests and also different types of access to study for those tests. But more importantly, if we are going to have a natural affinity for integration, it needs to begin earlier. And that's with a diverse classroom, et cetera. Because even in this city, Yvonne, one of the few places where you can have an integrated setting is the classroom, and so I intentionally developed my class, a constitutional challenge class affecting African, Latino, and Asian Americans, intentionally to bring different groups of people to the classroom. And you have to be intentional of what you're trying to accomplish. Otherwise, it will not happen naturally. And so for that reason, I am supportive of a holistic admissions policy. Okay, now there was another question about, let's see, staff's, yes, I totally agree with Dr. Kim. One of the problems that we have is, immigrant parents, working 24/7, don't have the time to take English classes, don't have the time or the luxury to take history classes, where they can learn about American history. And so that's a huge problem. And how do we integrate that into their sphere of learning as an adult? And again, to be creative, you know what I mean? What are places that they do go? What role can institutions of faith play in helping to educate the communities? And campaigns. It takes thoughtful leadership, uh, and for leaders to come together to make it happen. And so it is an issue, but then you have to really look at where they are going, you know what I mean? And what avenues are they have open to them, whether it be WeChat, whether it be ethnic radio, an ethnic cable television show that they watch, and really going to their sources of information, and working with them to help play a role in making those changes. But yeah. Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay. Any, and that's why, also Dr. Kim, why I bring, as Rebecca and Amani know, different speakers to my class, like you are bringing me to UVA today, because otherwise they will not have exposure to them. So I have brought, I have in different classes, victims of police brutality, undocumented students, people from marginalized communities who have lost a loved one to COVID-19 because their community did not have a testing center in their neighborhood because it was poor. And what it's like to lose a loved one whose life could have been saved if there had been a fair distribution of resources. And so, and that's what we have to do. If, you've got to be intentional about learning and having voices be represented if otherwise they're not, and finding ways to make that happen. So it brings me great pride that, Rebecca is a student who was, and Amani too, excellent students that I've had. And they thought of a way, to, bring further knowledge to UVA. And so they're, it brings me great joy that they are using tools we emphasized in our class, and really applying it to the world they live in. And we have to keep doing that. And myself, it's a constant reminder to remember whose voices are not being heard, and how can we get them to be heard in whatever setting that we are in. Okay, and is there any other questions? Okay, anybody else have any other questions?
I guess I'll just say that I'll definitely be looking more into, I guess, any of those sorts of organizing and things like that, specifically to help, I think, folks in my generation to communicate with their parents about these issues. I feel like, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I feel like so many Asian Americans already have complicated relationships with their parents. I haven't met a single Asian American who has a perfectly great relationship with their parents. They always got some sort of issue. But so I think it even complicates further, right? There's already things like language barriers and things like that are already making the relationship strained in certain ways. So I think with my mom, for instance, she's just so busy with work all the time that I think for me to lecture her about this is why you should care about this group of people who you probably don't even engage with on a day-to-day basis. I think she tends to just sort of just say I'm being oversensitive whenever I tell her like you can't say that, like you can't, like I don't know what else to say at this point, but like you can't just. And I've tried, like, I think sort of trying to appeal to her sense of empathy by being like, like these things that you say about Black Americans, right? I think that the same place that this is coming from, like you can't make generalizations about this whole group of people and also resent and be fearful of the fact that these other people are making assumptions about Asians, right? By saying that we all have the coronavirus and that we're all vectors for disease, right? And she like thought about it for a second. She's like, "Now you're being." I was like, "You can't be fearful of like being stereotyped and then stereotype other people." But anyways, Mother O is a work in progress. I mean, aren't we
You
all?
use other ways, you use films, you use other spokespeople, people in her generation that she respects,
Mm.
to help be the messenger, and things. Just give you an example. Biases, and especially unconscious biases, it's like a computer. Every time there is a negative unconscious bias, you have to enter new information into the memory of the computer to help erase that negative bias. So I had a Pakistani client who was facing removal from this country after 9/11. And, you know, the backlash against Arab Muslims and South Asians after 9/11 was horrendous, and in many ways worse than what East Asians are going through now. And he worked in a fast food restaurant in a heavily African American neighborhood. And one time when he was closing up the shop, he was attacked and robbed and knifed. And I was helping him fill out victim compensation forms. And he was saying very negative comments about African Americans. And then I said to him, Ali, who was the majority of your customers in that area who patronized you on a regular basis? And he would say African Americans. And I said, 2 African Americans attacked you. How many more African Americans went to your store and have kept your store alive, and, operable during all these years, you know what I mean? And stuff. And then I would go back to remember 9/11 and what you were going through, you know what I mean? And how you didn't like being labeled as a terrorist. You know, your experience, you are putting on a whole race of people, and it was 2 people, you know what I mean? And stuff. And, making him refocus, and putting new information into that computer, into his brain, to erase a negative experience. But a negative experience, you need many more positive experiences to outweigh that one very negative experience. And so, and then you have to think if they're working, because he stopped working at that restaurant, you know what I mean, and didn't want to work there anymore. And so he operates now a food truck in Lower Manhattan. And, because he was afraid. And my fear for him is, rather than run away, is he getting the experiences that he needs, the 10 times more experiences that he needs to put in his brain memory to overcome that negative one? You with me? And so, and that's what we have to constantly do. You know, when we have a negative experiences, we have to force ourselves to have positive ones. So, you know, with the recent incidences in New York City, um, I was not going to let it stop me from enjoying the beauty of New York City. You know what I mean? I rode the N line where uh, you know, several people were shot at in a subway car because I had to go to a training in the area, and I uh, was not going to let it stop me. You know what I mean? Um, that very night of the Sunset Park shooting, um, I had a uh, faculty roundtable at Columbia, which was really wonderful and very diverse. And I'm so glad it did not stop me from going to that. You know what I mean? Um, and you know, so we, you know, have to constantly be thinking of how we can do it. And it's much more challenging with in situations like your mom when she's working so hard. You know, where can she get those influences? And you just have to really think what is her circle of reference, and you know, trying to use those references to make those inroads. Uh, um, you know, and then what I would do is constantly, you know, tell my parents of positive experiences that I've had. And because even though they didn't have that interaction, they were happy that I did. And what was really formative is having a roommate who was African American. You know what I mean? Um, because you really learn to treat somebody as equal when you live with each other. You know, you use the same bathroom, you use the same phone, you use, you know what I mean, at that time, you know, you cook in the same kitchen, you know, et cetera, and you are equals. And you know, and that was really eye-opening, I think, for my parents. You know what I mean? Because you know, they wanted to be sure that I was safe where I was living, you know, and that I had roommates that were, you know, positive and helpful, and so forth. And so, you know, it was incremental. When I would speak on the phone with my mom, you know, I would always mention a few things, you know what I mean? And about Nellie, you know, and then my mom came for my graduation and met Nellie, you know, you know, and it was really a positive exchange, you know, and so, and vice versa. I met Nellie's parents, you know what I mean? Like a second grandmother to me, her, you know, her her extended family. And so it's breaking it down in little steps, you know what I mean, and stuff. And you know, so you find different ways. You're not lecturing them, but indirectly, you know what I mean. Oh, mom, you know what Nellie and I did today? You know, oh, mom, you know, I was so busy today. Nellie did the cooking, and you know, she made this unbelievable dish with such and such and such and such in it. You know what I mean? And it's little things. So it's not, it's finding ways not to say it directly, but indirectly. You know what I mean? Yes, as Dr. Kim said, great empathy-based strategies, you know, and really help, you know, because you know what you build on is their love for you. You know what I mean? You know, bottom line, every parent wants their child to be happy, to be safe, to have good friends, and you build on that. You know what I mean? And that makes a big difference, you know. And so, um, okay. Yes, Imani, it's a lifelong journey attacking those biases with our parents. It really is, because it does go both ways. You know, I've dealt with African Americans who feel Asian Americans don't know African American history and disrespect them. And you know, so I have law school friends, you know, when 9/11 happened, my African American law school friend commented, you know, Liz, what's happening to Arab Muslims and South Asians is not right, but I would feel more empathy if they would pick me up when I'm trying to hail a cab. You know what I mean? And so I tell that story when I'm with Arab South Asian groups, when they talk about coalition building, I remind them it goes both ways. You know what I mean? And, if you want to build a broader coalition, you also have to, not only in times of need, but, every day, think how you are integrating others into your life as well. You know what I mean? And so it's constant. It's really constant. But Amani, it's like what I, tried to emphasize over and over in this talk. You have to be intentional. You know what I mean? If you want to create those opportunities for learning for your parents, it have to be intentional how you going about doing it. You know what I mean? And thinking outside the box. It may not be you, or if it is you, it's through indirect incremental ways. You know what I mean? And looking at who they do respect and reaching out to them to make inroads, you know what I mean? Is also really important. And so, but you have to be able to create those opportunities for those exchanges to happen. And so, but it's constant. It's constant. Okay, so let's see how we're doing, my friends. Okay, 2 minutes for last minute question. Let's see the chat. I forgot. Yeah, yeah, yep, yep. I just, for instance, oh, I just cleaned. I don't know if I'll be able to find it easily, but I would show you. I recently went to a production. It was Gong Long's Legacy. It was based on true stories of a Chinese person who married an African American woman in the South, and this was at the time when the Supreme Court was about to decide that decision of whether or not Chinese could go to school with whites. And it was a play done by an African American writer, and just saw it in New York City. And what's so much meaningful is the discussion after the play, right? The actors, actresses, they had professors, white and black, on the panel. And the Asian American professor, Rebecca, it was Jack Chen, who asked the actors and actresses, what was the most challenging thing for you to act in this play? And the young African American woman who played the wife of Gong Long, said, when I did the history research, I learned that during that period of time when Asian American women were not allowed to come, and Asian laborers took on African American wives, that later, when Asian American women were allowed to come, they dumped their African American wives. And so she said she had to really reach down deep to feel love for the Asian American man who she was marrying, in the play, because she, in the back of her mind, remembered the history. And so, and that was really telling, you know what I mean? So it's important that we tell these stories, but it's important that the many facets of these stories also come out, you know what I mean? When you peel the onion, and to get at that depth of empathy that we're talking about, because when you see this play, you do have empathy for a couple in love who are facing all these barriers simply because of their race. But at the same time, there's empathy upon empathy, you know what I mean, of, you know, where those parallels are, and not to forget them, you know what I mean? Um, there was this whole struggle of Chinese wanting to go to the school with the whites, but, you know, the way the story is told, what about, you know, blacks who want to go to an integrated school too, you know what I mean? Um, and, uh, um, and uh, the way that story is told, it was like a given that blacks were not going to be able to go to school with whites. But the Asians were not willing to give up on that fight. And so they wanted to go to, you know, court to challenge it, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and that may have really been the reality at the time, that it was so entrenched that, you know, the thought of blacks being able to go to school with whites may not have been within the realm of reality then. Um, but the point is, you know, um, why is that? You know what I mean? And being able to identify with the history entrenchment, that someone would feel that, you know what I mean? And the longevity of racism that uh, is so hard to undo, to the point that people began to normalize uh, those forms of discrimination. And so, you know, so that's are some of the things that we need to peel away at. And so that play was really important. And now in Brooklyn, there's another play of similar, of a black and white marriage, you know what I mean? Not a black and Asian marriage, but a black and white marriage, during the time of when they were going to decide whether or not intermarriage would be allowed between black and white. So all these things are coming up, and you know, it's important to look for opportunities to educate yourself, and bring others with you, you know, and broaden that circle of knowledge and sharing. Um, Okay, well, I'm a little over, uh, you are most welcome. It's great to see former students and great to meet new people. And kudos to UVA for starting Asian Heritage Month on such a strong note, you know, of a collaboration. And I wish you a rest of a good celebration for the month of May, and a good spring term, the remainder of it.
Thank you so much for taking time to speak with us today. See, for myself, I learned a lot, and thank you for giving us not only information but also practical steps and things to do with this information as well. I'm going to drop for you all a just a quick survey for you all to do. Just give us some feedback on the program. If this link does not work for you, let me share my screen as well so you all can access a QR code. Hopefully it's on the screen right now. But yeah, I encourage you all to do the feedback survey to let the office know how we did on coordinating the events. Any other questions other than that, I hope you all have a good afternoon, okay? Yep.
Thanks for organizing this, Jair, and thank you, Professor OuYang.
Shout out to you, Beck. Appreciate you helping out as well. Thank you.
All right, bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Yep.
Okay. Bye. You're welcome.
Goodbye. Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Have a good night.